Let's dive into one of the most ambitious and, frankly, one of the most controversial technology projects ever. We're talking about Aadhaar, India's digital ID system for over a billion people. But this story isn't really about the tech. It's about a bitter, knockdown, drag-out fight over power, privacy, and maybe even the very soul of a nation.
And this whole thing kicks off not in a lab or a government office, but with this incredibly tense public moment. An activist, Sujatha Gidla, says this directly to Rohini Nailekani, who happens to be the wife of Aadhaar's creator. Wow. You can just feel the raw personal anger at the heart of this whole debate. This was never just about policy, you see. It was a moral war.
So that's the big question, right? How on earth did a project designed to give every Indian an identity end up sparking such an ugly, bitter feud? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go right back to the beginning.
To really get Aadhaar, you first have to get your head around the problem it was trying to solve. And honestly, the scale of that problem it's almost impossible to comprehend. Just think about it. How do you uniquely identify over a billion people?
At its core, the idea was actually pretty simple, and for the people who created it, it was deeply humanitarian. You had millions upon millions of Indians with no formal ID whatsoever, which basically locked them out of the system. Aadhaar was meant to fix that. It would give every single person a unique number so they could finally open a bank account and get government benefits directly, cutting out the corrupt middlemen who were skimming off the top.
But for its founder, Nandan Nilekani, Aadhaar was never just an ID card. Not even close. He saw it as a piece of fundamental digital infrastructure, kind of like the internet or GPS, an open platform that anyone could build new services on top of. The ambition here was absolutely staggering.
But, when you have that kind of ambition, it's bound to attract a ferocious backlash. And this wasn't just some quiet disagreement. This was an all-out war for the future of the project.
And this is where things get really polarized. You had this huge gap between two completely opposite views. On one side, you have the promise of bringing millions into the financial system, welfare reform. But on the other side, a truly terrifying accusation that Aadhaar was nothing more than a tool for mass surveillance that would crush free speech and political activism.
But here's where the source material we're looking at offers a different take. It suggests the protests weren't just about privacy. It actually frames the whole conflict as a turf war. The argument here is that the activists and the middlemen, who had been the gatekeepers for the poor for decades, saw this tech billionaire, Nandan Nilekani, as an outsider who was stepping on their turf.
So this opposition, it was a really interesting mix. According to the source, you had activists who were just generally suspicious of any kind of billionaire philanthropy. You had old-school socialists who felt their entire worldview was being threatened. And then you had this middle-class group that basically resented the whole thing because it looked like an idea copied from the West.
Okay, so you're Nandan Nilekani, and your grand vision is under attack from all sides. What do? Well, his journey took a pretty dramatic turn, forcing him out of the political ring and into a very different kind of fight. So in 2014, Nilekani actually ran for political office, and he lost. He later called it a public rejection, a traumatic experience. And that failure was a huge turning point. It basically slammed the door on one possible future for Aadhaar.
So he realized that being a politician just wasn't going to happen. Plan A, using political power to push Aadhaar through, was officially dead. He needed a plan B. He couldn't force it on the country anymore. He had to convince the people in power that his creation was absolutely essential.
And that led to probably the most important meeting of his entire life. He gets to sit down with the new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. Now, this was incredibly high stakes because Modi's party had been one of the loudest critics of the whole project. The entire future of Aadhaar pretty much came down to this one conversation.
And his pitch was, well, it was brilliant. First, he didn't talk about helping the poor. He talked about saving money, framing Aadhaar as a tool to cut the national deficit. Smart. Second, he pointed out that it was already legally sanctioned. And third, he positioned it as this modern tech-savvy solution for a new India. He wasn't just selling a project, he was selling a vision of a modern country. And it worked.
But even with the new government on his side, the battle was not over. Not by a long shot. The final, decisive fight for Aadhaar's survival was going to happen in the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of India.
From Nilekani's point of view, this was it. This was the endgame.
He believed that all those years of protests, the articles, the activism, it was all aimed at one specific audience, the judges of the Supreme Court. Everything had been building to this final legal showdown.
And in the end, the court delivered a historic ruling. It basically said that an Indian citizen's fundamental right to an identity and the chance of prosperity that comes with it was more important than all the ideological arguments against the system. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over.
So, after all that conflict, all that drama, what is the legacy of this system today? The numbers, and I'm not exaggerating here, are just mind-boggling.
Today, more than 1.2 billion Indians have an Aadhaar identity. Let that sink in for a second. That makes it the largest biometric identification system anywhere on Earth, period.
And it's not just sitting there. People are using this thing constantly. It's used for over 2 billion authentications every single month, for everything from getting a new phone to collecting a pension.
This number, this is maybe the one that matters most. Over 100,000 crore rupees, that's more than 12 billion US dollars, has been transferred directly into citizens' bank accounts, all powered by Aadhaar. You know, the story of Aadhaar is just this incredible case study of what happens when massive technological ambition crashes into political reality. It did solve the huge problem of identification for hundreds of millions of people, but it also ignited this fierce, passionate debate about privacy and the power of the state. And it leaves us with this one really important question to think about. When technology solves one massive problem, does it always inevitably create another?